Sweat stung Peter Caldwell's eyes as he wrestled the rusted iron padlock off the main gate of his grandfather's property. For over 2 decades, Gabriel Caldwell had lived in self-imposed exile on this sprawling 50-acre stretch of dense Oregon timberland known locally as Oak Haven. Now, Gabriel was dead the victim of a sudden stroke, at 88, leaving Peter as the sole heir to an estate he hadn't visited since he was a small child. Peter had driven up from San Francisco with a singular goal: sell the land, empty the decaying Victorian house, and close the chapter on a grandfather who had always felt more like a ghost than a family member. Gabriel had been a cold, calculating man, respected by the locals of Blackwood Ridge, but loved by no one. Peter expected a weekend of sorting through antique furniture and dusty books. He never expected that Oak Haven was built on a graveyard of secrets. The property was a feral jungle of blackberry brambles, poison oak, and dying Douglas firs. To get the land surveyed and appraised for a quick sale to a commercial developer, Peter hired a local excavation contractor, a gruff-weathered man in his 60s named Silas Montgomery. On the 3rd day of clearing the overgrowth, the grinding roar of Silas' diesel backhoe suddenly sputtered and died, replaced by the sharp, echoing clang of metal striking metal. Peter, who had been hauling boxes of old clothes out of the main house, dropped his load and jogged toward the tree line. Silas was already out of the cab, staring down into a deep trench he had dug near the ruins of an old glass greenhouse. "Hit a septic tank, maybe?" Peter asked, wiping dirt from his forehead. Silas shook his head, his eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his stained baseball cap. "House plumbing runs north toward the county line. We're on the South Ridge, and nobody buries a tank this deep unless they don't want it found." Curiosity overriding caution, Peter grabbed a shovel and hopped into the muddy trench. Together, they cleared the damp, heavy clay away from the object. It wasn't a septic tank. It was a massive, industrial-grade steel lockbox, roughly the size of a deep freezer, wrapped in heavy-duty chains. The metal was pitted and rusted, indicating it had been buried for decades. Using the heavy hydraulic teeth of the excavator, Silas snapped the chains. Peter found a crowbar in the truck and wedged it beneath the heavy lid. With a groan of protesting metal, the lid gave way. A smell wafted up from the darkness, a sickening mixture of mothballs, chemical preservatives, and old stagnant air. Peter aimed his flashlight into the cavity, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was no gold. There were no family heirlooms. Inside sat 6 olive-green military surplus ammunition crates, all sealed tightly. Beneath them, wrapped tightly in thick, translucent industrial plastic and bound with duct tape, were 3 distinct, human-sized bundles. Peter dropped the crowbar. The heavy iron tool thudded dully against the dirt. Silas took one look into the steel vault, pulled off his hat, and reached for his cell phone. "I'm calling the state troopers, kid. Step away from the hole." While Silas walked up the ridge to find a cell signal, Peter's morbid fascination took over. He reached into the steel vault and carefully pulled out the top ammunition crate. The heavy latch popped open with a hiss. Inside, perfectly preserved away from the moisture of the earth, were stacks of black, leather-bound ledgers and hundreds of Polaroid photographs. Peter opened the first ledger. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's, a neat, slanted, meticulous cursive. But this wasn't a diary, it was an accounting book of human misery. The date started in 1978. Gabriel Caldwell had not merely been a retired lumber mill manager, as Peter had been told. He had been the town's shadow bank. The ledgers detailed loans made to desperate locals at staggering illegal interest rates. But the columns didn't just track money. They tracked collateral. Peter's fingers trembled as he traced the names. Gregory Finch, Farm Equipment. Defaulted 1980, Abigail Foster. Retail Storefront, defaulted 1981. William and Sarah Hammond, 40 Acres Riverfront. Defaulted October 14, 1982. Next to the Hammonds' names, written in a stark, thick red ink was a single word underlined twice, liquidated. Peter grabbed a handful of the Polaroids. The first few were mundane shots of local properties. But as he shuffled through the deck, the imagery shifted into a waking nightmare. The photo showed the interior of the old greenhouse, the very structure whose ruined foundation sat just yards away from where Peter stood. In the pictures, the glass was intact, and the room was illuminated by harsh work lights. Sitting in the center of the room, bound tightly to a heavy wooden chair, was a terrified man with a bruised face. Peter flipped the photo over. On the back, in Gabriel's handwriting, Gregory Finch. Final notice, the next photo was of a woman crying, gagged with a rag. Abigail Foster. Gabriel hadn't just foreclosed on properties. When people couldn't pay, he tortured them, murdered them, and buried them on his estate to silently seize their assets through forged deeds. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled Peter from his horror. He scrambled out of the trench, clutching the ledger and the photographs to his chest. Down the long driveway, a vehicle was approaching. It wasn't the blue and gold of the Oregon State Police. It was a white SUV bearing the emblem of the Blackwood Ridge County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Thomas Sterling stepped out of the vehicle. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that carried the arrogant authority of a man who owned the town. He was followed by a younger, nervous-looking deputy named Miller. Silas called it in to the dispatcher, Sheriff Sterling said smoothly, adjusting his gun belt as he walked toward the excavation site. Said you boys found something out here, Sheriff, Peter stammered, his mind racing. It's a mass grave. My grandfather, he was murdering people. I have the proof right here. Sterling stopped at the edge of the trench. He looked down at the plastic-wrapped bundles, then slowly turned his gaze to the ledger in Peter's hands. His expression didn't register shock or horror or even surprise. His face hardened into a mask of cold calculation. Deputy Miller, Sterling said without turning his head. Go secure the perimeter, down by the main gate. Don't let anyone up this road. But, Sheriff, the state boys are... Do as I say, Miller, Sterling barked. The young deputy flinched and jogged back down the driveway. Peter watched the exchange, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He looked down at the open ledger in his hands. He flipped back a few pages, his eyes frantically scanning the neat cursive. He stopped on a page dated November 1982. Payment to Deputy Richard Sterling. For silence regarding the Hammond transfer. $10,000. Peter looked up. Sheriff Thomas Sterling was staring directly at him. Richard Sterling had been the former sheriff, Thomas's father. Your grandfather was a very difficult man, Peter, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. But he understood how the world actually works. Blackwood Ridge was dying in the 80s. The mills were closing. People were starving. Gabriel had capital. My father kept the peace. It was an ugly symbiosis, but it kept this town alive. Sterling unsnapped the retention strap on his leather holster. Half the businesses on Main Street were built with Gabriel's seed money. The new high school wing was funded by the Caldwell Trust. If what's in that box gets out, the federal government comes in here and tears this entire county apart to its foundations. You knew, Peter whispered, stepping backward toward the backhoe. Your family helped him cover up serial murder. I'm protecting my town, son, Sterling said, drawing his sidearm. He pointed it loosely at Peter's chest. Now hand over the book. We'll incinerate the papers, fill in the hole, and you can go back to California a very rich man. And if I don't, Peter asked, his voice shaking. Then you suffered a tragic accident while operating heavy machinery on unstable ground, Sterling replied, raising the barrel. Gabriel always said you were too soft for this world. Seems he was right. Before Sterling's finger could tighten on the trigger, a deafening blast of an air horn shattered the silence. From the tree line behind them, Silas Montgomery's heavy dump truck roared into the clearing, crushing saplings beneath its massive tires. Silas had seen the sheriff arrive and, knowing the town's dark history, hadn't waited for permission. He drove the massive truck directly at the sheriff's cruiser, smashing into the side of the white SUV and pushing it into the ravine with a screech of tearing metal. Distracted and panicked, Sterling whipped around, aiming his weapon at the truck. Peter didn't hesitate. He hurled the heavy leather ledger directly at Sterling's head and bolted into the dense blackberry thicket. Sterling cursed, firing a wild shot into the brush that clipped the bark of a pine tree inches from Peter's face. Sirens wailed in the distance, echoing off the mountain ridge. Real sirens this time. Silas hadn't just called the local dispatcher, he had called the state police barracks directly from his radio. Within 10 minutes, Oak Haven was swarming with state troopers. Sheriff Sterling was disarmed and forced to his knees in the mud, screaming about jurisdiction and town legacy while handcuffs were ratcheted onto his wrists. The subsequent months were a blur of federal investigations, media circuses, and forensic excavations. The FBI took over the property. The lockbox was just the beginning. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 9 more graves scattered across the 50 acres. Gabriel Caldwell was posthumously exposed as one of the most prolific and organized serial killers in Oregon history. The town of Blackwood Ridge was rocked by scandals as decades of corrupt land deeds, bribes, and extortions came to light. The Sterling family name was ruined. Peter cooperated fully, handing over every asset, every penny in the Caldwell Trust, to the families of the victims. He wanted nothing to do with the blood money. He was finally ready to put Oak Haven behind him forever. Then he received a phone call from Agent Harrison, the lead FBI investigator assigned to the forensic identification team. Harrison asked Peter to come down to the federal field office in Portland. When Peter arrived, Harrison was sitting behind a metal desk, looking exhausted. He slid a manila folder across the surface. "We finished the DNA profiles on all the remains," Harrison said quietly. "We've identified all 12 victims. I wanted to speak to you personally about the couple in the primary vault. The ones wrapped in plastic." "William and Sarah Hammond," Peter said, remembering the names from the ledger. "The ones from 1982. Harrison nodded. Gabriel seized their 40-acre riverfront property and folded it into the Oak Haven estate. But when we ran the victims' DNA profiles against the national database to find living relatives for notification, we got an immediate, undeniable, familial match." Peter frowned. "Okay. Did you find their children?" Harrison looked at Peter with an expression of profound pity. He tapped the folder. "Peter, we ran your DNA when you submitted your fingerprints for the crime scene exclusion. The match wasn't in the public database. The match was you." The breath left Peter's lungs. The sterile white walls of the FBI office seemed to spin. "I don't understand. Your father, the man you thought was your father, Gabriel's son, died in a car crash when you were a baby, right?" "Yes," Peter whispered. "We checked the birth records," Harrison said softly. The certificates were signed by Sheriff Richard Sterling. They were forged. Harrison leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gabriel Caldwell wasn't your grandfather, Peter. When William and Sarah Hammond refused to sign over their land, Gabriel killed them. But they had an infant son. A son Gabriel needed alive to eventually pass the laundered massive estate down to without raising suspicion from the state tax board. The man Peter had mourned, the ghost of a grandfather whose property he had inherited, was the monster who had orphaned him. Peter was not a Caldwell. He was Peter Hammond, the last surviving victim of Oak Haven, raised on the very soil that held the bones of his parents. The 50 acres of Oregon poison oak suddenly didn't feel like an inheritance anymore. It felt like a tomb that had finally, violently, been forced open.